The presentation of anarchism as social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race. The emancipation.
Anarchist Essays is brought to you by Loughborough University's Anarchism Research Group. For more information on the ARG, see the link in the show notes or follow us on Twitter at ARGLBORO.
Green Anarchy and Red Praxis, an anarcho-Indigenous dialogue towards a democracy of species by Robert T.F. Downes. What does it mean to talk about anarchism and indigeneity in the same breath, without collapsing one into the other or turning either into a metaphor? And what might it mean to imagine a democracy of species out of a dialogue between the two? To imagine a politics in which non-human animals or rivers or forests are treated not as property but as participants. In my article, Green Anarchy and Red Praxis, an anarcho-Indigenous dialogue towards a democracy of species, I try to answer those questions by bringing Murray Bookchin's eco-anarchist philosophy of social ecology into conversation with Indigenous political thought. The exercise takes place over a very concrete legal contest, the Standing Rock litigation over the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. In this essay, I want to do two things. First, sketch some specific scenes of anarcho-Indigenous solidarities around the globe, and second, dwell on what I call complementarities amongst incommensurables, or the ways eco-anarchism, with its European settler radical roots, and the pluriverse of Indigenous political thought, can enter into a mutually enriching exchange, meeting, challenging, and deepening each other's critiques of the rule of law, as well as their experiments with alternative forms of justice. Indeed, the term anarcho-indigenism speaks to exactly this tension, an imperfect synthesis, rather than some sort of homogenizing fusion of ideas. Let me start with the legal architecture that anarchists and indigenous movements are up against, the rule of law as an operating system of assimilation, conformity, and above all, domination. The liberal rule of law is often presented as a neutral, objective, even-handed system that protects rights and maintains order by placing everyone under the same rules. Viewed from Standing Rock, however, itself an instantiation of a much longer history of settler colonial domination in North America, and the United States in particular, it looks quite different. In the context of settler colonial capitalism, law functions less like a scale and more like an operating system. It encodes hierarchies of race, class, gender, and species into the very grammar of legality. In the Standing Rock case, the Standing Rock Sioux and Cheyenne River Sioux tribes challenged the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers' approval of an oil pipeline crossing underneath Lake Oahe, arguing that the Corps had violated federal law, namely the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, N-E-P-A. The construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline put the reservation's water at risk of contamination and put sacred sites at risk of destruction. In the earlier stages of litigation, the D.C. Circuit ultimately agreed that the Corps had acted unlawfully. Its environmental review was inadequate, and hence construction of the pipeline had been authorized in violation of NEPA. Yet the oil continued to flow. By separating the legality of the permit from the actual operation of the pipeline, the Court of Appeals managed to recognize the tribe's arguments in principle while neutralizing them in practice. Precedent, procedure, and, quote, disruptive economic consequences, end quote, outweighed indigenous sovereignty and ecological harm. What one sees here is not an aberration of the rule of law. Instead, the episode clearly reveals what neoliberal laws are designed to protect: private property, extractive capital, and the state's own claims to supreme authority. In this way, the law's promise of equality remains gestural, as indigenous scholars like Glenn Coulthard point out. With respect to substance, or reality, The law functions to manage a long history of colonial theft, violence, and contaminated sites of sacrifice. From an anarcho-Indigenous point of view, Standing Rock shows law not as a universal guarantor of justice, but as a historically specific technology of domination, a language of statecraft, a linguistics of control. It follows that anarcho-Indigenous solidarities are not simply moral alliances, they are radical experiments in living otherwise. I will briefly outline a few of these experiments. First, Standing Rock itself. The camps and protest sites were indigenous spaces of resistance and resurgence, grounded in Lakota and Dakota relations to land and water, as well as to the non-human and more than human worlds. There were also meeting points. Anarchists, anti-authoritarian climate activists, and other radicals joined native land defenders in direct action, mutual aid, and shared risk. One finds a sort of embryonic anarcho-Indigenous politics in the everyday life of these camps. Communal kitchens, medic tents, consensus decision-making, childcare, and security organized without police, insistence that water is life, not a commodity, and the understanding that struggle was not only for treaty rights, but for the river, for future generations, and for non-human relatives. Second, Chiapas and the Zapatista caracoles. The Zapatista revolution actualizes many of the principles that eco-anarchists care deeply about: decentralized power, assembly-based decision-making, land collectivization, and an explicit refusal of the state as the locus of justice or authority. The Zapatista caracoles are autonomous municipalities organized in rotating councils. They are rooted, in part, in indigenous Maya traditions of governance and land stewardship. The caracoles have become reference points for anarchists across the world as a living experiment of non-state, directly democratic, ecological, and emancipatory politics. For instance, the article makes reference to the Zapatistas' Women's Revolutionary Law, drafted from the experiences and demands of women within the movement, and it is a striking example of law emerging from below rather than being imposed from above. Third, Aotearoa, or New Zealand. In so-called New Zealand, anarchist collectives such as the Tamaki Makarau have worked alongside Maori-led initiatives resisting colonial policing and land dispossessions. The long struggle over ihumatau, land seized by the New Zealand Crown in the 19th century and later earmarked for housing development, drew in a broad coalition of indigenous and anarchist activists. Maori leadership and ethics, or takanga, to oversimplify the term, set the terms. Anarchists and other radicals contributed labor, logistics, and support, often being explicit that their role was to follow indigenous direct action rather than to lead. Across this selection of cases, anarcho-indigenous solidarities are neither smooth nor symmetrical. As the term implies, friction or tension is constant over tactics, over the political meaning of sovereignty and freedom, and over who gets to speak and decide. But those frictions are precisely where complementarities among incommensurables begin to emerge. What do I mean by that phrase? Eco-anarchism and indigenous thought are incommensurable in at least three ways. First, they emerge from different histories. Anarchism grows out of European and internationalist labor struggles, anti-state socialism, and critiques of industrial capitalism. Indigenous political thought and critical theory is grounded in place-based cosmologies, deep histories of ancestry and kinship, treaties with human and more than human beings, as well as memories of genocide, dispossession, and survival. Second, they have different relationships to land. For many anarchists, the central enemy is property, or private property specifically, and the state. The commons is often imagined in the abstract. For indigenous peoples, land is not the commons in general, but the specific territories to which they belong and from which they have been violently separated. As Glenn Coulthard reminds us, the return of the commons cannot ignore the fact that the commons in question already belong to somebody. Third, they have different orientations toward modernity and technology. Murray Bookchin, for instance, was a secular humanist who dismissed romantic primitivism and sometimes even caricatured indigenous cosmologies as mystical or anti-rational. Many indigenous traditions, by contrast, do not separate spirituality from politics or ecology. Creation stories, oral histories, ceremonies, and the teachings of non-human relatives are all part of how the law and ethics of Mother Nature are understood and practiced. However, precisely because these frameworks do not collapse into each other, they are able to form complementarities, overlapping or imbricated lines of critique and imagination that strengthen each other while remaining distinct. Consider three such complementarities: property as theft versus land as relation. European anarchists like Proudhon declared that property is theft, pointing to the enclosures of the commons and the transformation of shared land into private commodity. Contemporary decolonial scholars like Brenna Bandar and Robert Nichols demonstrate how property itself is constituted through recurring acts of theft. Treaties broken, ancestral territories converted into wastelands through the activities of extractive industry. Eco-anarchism offers a general critique of property and proposes alternatives based on usufruct, mutual aid, and what Murray Bookchin calls the irreducible minimum, the idea that everyone is owed what they need for a dignified life, simply by virtue of being human. Indigenous thought pushes that critique further by insisting that land is not primarily an object of redistribution, but a set of ongoing relations and responsibilities, extending to non-human beings and connecting past and future generations. Together, they invite us to move beyond the liberal conception of rights as property, or rather, the rights-bearing subject as some sort of proprietorial abstraction, as Bandar might put it, and instead move toward an ethics of shared use and reciprocal obligation. This might mean seeing calls for land back and the abolition of private property not as separate agendas, but as two sides of the same emancipatory project. Second, there is the critique of the rule of law and counter-legalities. Social ecology is uncompromising in its critique of the state, of courts, of police, and of prisons. These institutions are seen as crystallizations of domination that cannot be reformed into neutrality. Instead, anarchists imagine decentralized, directly democratic, and restorative forms of conflict resolution that render coercive institutions obsolete. Indigenous thought from John Burroughs to Kyle White and Robin Wall Kimmerer to the Red Socialists of the Red Nation all speak of counter-legalities, alternative indigenous legal orders grounded in land and community-based practices of deliberation and restorative justice. These systems emphasize restoration over punishment, responsibilities over rights, and relational harmony over individual contract. Eco-anarchy and this pluriverse of indigenous epistemologies of justice and care expose the liberal rule of law as only a very particular and very violent tradition, rather than some universal baseline for justice. At the same time, they sketch an alternative, stateless or quasi-stateless legalities rooted in consent, community authority, participatory decision-making, and the recognition of non-human and more than human agency. Finally, consider degrowth and grounded normativity. Bookchin's social ecology argues that ecological crisis and social domination are co-constitutive. You cannot resolve one without dismantling the other. He imagines a post-capitalist, high-technology yet degrowth society that is decentralized, run through municipal assemblies, and organized around meeting human needs rather than maximizing profit. Indigenous thinkers like Leanne Bedasamasaki Simpson and Robin Wall Kimmerer argue from what Coulthard calls grounded normativity, ethical frameworks that arise from long-term place-based practices and relations with land and other beings. They call for resurgence, or a recentering of indigenous law, languages, and economies that do not depend on the recognition of neoliberal nation-states. Here, too, complementarities appear. Degrowth and indigenous land back are not identical projects, but they converge in rejecting growth for growth's sake, in centering ecological limits rather than GDP. Here, complementarities also appear. Degrowth and indigenous land back are not identical projects, but they converge in rejecting growth for growth's sake, in centering ecological limits rather than GDP, and in insisting that political authority be rooted in local relationships and participatory democracy, rather than distant bureaucracies. Now we move to the democracy of species, or how both converge on the idea of moving beyond a human-only or anthropocentric politics. One of the strongest links between eco-anarchism and indigenous thought lies in how they both avert anthropocentrism. Bookchin's ideas on dialectical naturalism insist that human societies are not outside nature, but are instead expressions of it. Our self-consciousness, or our capacity for reflection, communication, and even technological progress, grows out of a long evolutionary history of cooperation and differentiation within and between the human and non-human worlds. Indigenous ecologies go further by explicitly recognizing non-human beings as persons, or even nations with their own agency and claims. Kimmerer speaks of a democracy of species, governed by the laws of Mother Nature. Treaties in some nations are conceived not only between other nation-states or even between human parties, but between peoples and specific animals, waters, or mountains. When one brings these together, we can begin to think about multi-species forms of environmental justice and environmental sovereignty that outgrow the rule of law's anthropocentric myopia. A democracy of species would require legal and political forms that look much closer to anarcho-Indigenous experiments than to constitutional courts. One might imagine a council where elders, youth, and knowledge keepers deliberate alongside scientists and farmers, or processes of accountability that focus on repairing relationships rather than simply punishing offenders. One catches glimpses of this in Zapatista assemblies, in Wet'suwet'en feast halls in what is called British Columbia, Canada, in Indigenous women's relationship to water, and in the Standing Rock camps. They all gesture towards an alternative jurisprudence. If we now return to Standing Rock, one sees it as a sort of hinge between these worlds. Inside the courtroom, the tribes confronted the full weight of the neoliberal rule of law. NEPA's intent of environmental protection was narrowed to strictly procedural questions. Colonial property regimes were treated as unquestionable, and the quote-unquote public interest was equated with uninterrupted oil flows and investor certainty. Even when the court recognized illegality on the part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, it refused to envision a remedy that would genuinely shift power. Outside the courtroom, people are already living differently, through networks of care and defense. Police and private security are ever present, of course, with all the brutality that we have come to expect, but this does not put an end to the living archives of anarcho-Indigenous solidarity and experiments on the ground. My argument in the article and in this essay is not that those experiments have already solved the problem of justice, or justice in the Anthropocene. They have not. They are fragile, contested, and constantly threatened. But they do something that the neoliberal rule of law and eco-authoritarianism both refuse to do. They invite us to think about freedom, justice, and care beyond the state and beyond property. They also urge humanity to think about action beyond the human alone. For those who would like to explore these ideas in more detail, the written essay delves deeper into the Standing Rock judgment, eco-anarchist theory, and indigenous counter-legalities. Here I have only tried to trace a few of the threads. Think of it as a set of scenes and concepts that I hope show why anarchist and indigenous struggles can not only stand together, but might need each other for a democracy of species. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To help others find anarchist essays, please rate and review us wherever you find your podcasts. And if you're interested in anarchist ideas, why not check out the journal Anarchist Studies? For over 20 years, Anarchist Studies has been publishing original research on the history, theory, and practice of anarchism. For more information, visit www.lwbooks.co.uk/anarchist-studies.